Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. I'm reminding myself to shut my cell phones off or put them on buzz. So thank you for also checking yours. My name is Mike Sfraga. I'm the director of the Polar Initiative here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank you all for coming out on what is now a wonderful day outside, but I know in a few hours we're expecting it to not be so wonderful. So thank you for trying to time your arrival here with the pending thunderstorms that will no doubt come later on today. So I have the pleasure of presiding over a discussion with Lieutenant Governor Byron Mallott, and he will share with us the draft of the climate change policy for the state of Alaska. So I really want to thank you all that are here today to listen to this discussion, and for the many, many that are online across our country, in Alaska and abroad, thank you for taking the time to share this day with us. I want to thank, as we start out, our corporate council members who you see on this PowerPoint slide right there. Those companies, corporations are made up of individuals who care about the work that we do. And I want to thank them all very much, because we simply could not do the work that we do here every day without these friends. And that's GCI from the state of Alaska, Ukpiakvik Inupiat Corporation from Alaska, A2A, Alaska to Alberta Railway, that's a Canadian concern, and Ilunik Corporation from Alaska. Without our friends, we just don't do our work. So I want to just recognize their endless support. Today's program is also supported by the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. Our newest partner is the Arctic Encounters Symposium that many of you have attended in Seattle. We'll be doing work with them into the future, and the Institute of the North, which serves as a secretariat for the work that the Lieutenant Governor will describe here in a moment. And as always, our friend Veronica Slager at the North Star Group, who has supported all of our programs. So today's program is entitled Shaping Alaska's Climate Policy, a conversation with Alaska Lieutenant Governor Byron Mallott. So Lieutenant Governor will give a presentation. He'll join me for a discussion on stage. I've asked two of our senior fellows here at the Polar Institute, Sherry Goodman, who's a senior fellow in both our Polar program and the Environmental Change and Security program, to provide comment or perhaps ask a question. She's the former Deputy Undersecretary of State for Environmental Security. And I've asked our good friend David Bolton, Ambassador David Bolton, who's also a senior fellow in our program and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Fisheries at the U.S. Department of State, to also provide some comment and discussion. We want to make this a relaxed and engaging dialogue with the Lieutenant Governor. So I'm going to ask all of you to think about questions, raise issues, and we'll have microphones here, but we do want to make it casual yet professional. So as a pretext, as all of you know, the Arctic is warming twice as fast as elsewhere. And of course, our state in Alaska is feeling those changes. Over 30 villages are threatened, not just along the coast, but there are threatened villages and a way of life throughout our state. And a changing climate is a driver for related social, economic, and political change as well. But also, the state of Alaska is an energy supplier. It is reliant on natural resource development, in particular oil, to fund the vast majority of its economy. Oil and gas and resource development simply drives the state of Alaska. So, what policies, strategies, and related tactics might the state of Alaska employ that both address a changing Arctic climate while enabling Alaskans to continue to live and thrive in America's Arctic? Lieutenant Governor Mallott will address these and other issues as he shares with us today the state's response to climate change through the good work of the Climate Action Leadership Team and its draft climate change policy for the state of Alaska. I've also asked Lieutenant Governor Mallott if he would highlight his efforts to build partnerships with Pacific Island nations to create indigenous ocean-focused approaches to climate solutions. Now, many of you know Lieutenant Governor Mallott, and you've read his bio online, but I just want to highlight a few things before he takes the podium. Governor Bill Walker and Lieutenant Governor Mallott, took office in 2014 as the first non-partisan administration in Alaska's history. They are also the first Alaska-born governor and lieutenant governor to serve together. Lieutenant Governor Mallott is a respected leader in our state, but as a Tlingit, he is also a central figure in the Alaska Native community. He has held many positions in private, public, and nonprofit forum. He has served every governor since statehood. Every governor since statehood, since 1959. He has served as president of the Alaska Federation of Natives. He's the founding president of the First Alaskans Institute, He has been chair and executive director of the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. He has been the chair of the Nature Conservancy and is a member of the board of directors of the Polynesian Voyage Society. I threw that one in there because that's just fun. Please welcome to the podium the Lieutenant Governor for the state of Alaska, Byron Mallott.
Mike asked each of us to be relaxed and professional. I am not often professional, and I am certainly not going to be relaxed today, so he must have been speaking to all of the rest of you. I grew up in a small village on the Gulf of Alaska called Yakutat. When I was a little boy, it was principally a Tlingit community, the home of my mother, whose people had lived and on that land for many, many generations. And I recall as a little boy knowing that the land was always changing, that the ocean was always changing, that somehow, although it was strong and firm and seemingly incapable of significant change, that it was also very fragile. Some of our favorite fishing places along salmon streams would change so much from year to year that we would have to learn the place all over again. And so the notion of climate change and the changes to our earth grew on me more in an intellectual way than a value or a belief or a consciousness that comes from somehow witnessing it, because our world was always changing. But once it became clear, particularly as I thought about my children and my grandchildren, my son Ben is here, my wife and my youngest son, Sam Schimmel, who is a member of our Climate Alaska leadership team, is here. Both young men, both so passionate about their futures and their desire to be engaged in making this place one that they can know will continue to both inspire and create opportunity, not just for generations, but hopefully millennia to come. They drive for me the conversation. They drive for me the reason that we are all here. I remember my Tlingit uncle, Paul Henry, taking me in his seal hunting skiff up to a glacier at the face of which we would hunt seal. And never having a thought, or even if told, that that glacier might not be there at some point in our future, I would not have believed it. It was that large, it was that massive, it was that powerful, it was that ultimately immutable. And I think for many of us, the notion that our world can change and change in ways that are driven by forces and by phenomena which are the consequence of our own actions over a long period of time, can literally determine the fate of our planet, becomes something both very easy but also among the most difficult to wrap our emotional and intellectual beings around. To become more practical, when it became clear that our federal government was beginning to step away from climate change as an imperative of our government, the governor and I, who had largely been associated with climate change through the work of the Arctic Council, and Arctic policy, of course, is driven largely by climate change. The sense of responsibility that, again, a place as large as Alaska, a place that is Alaska, is the United States' only Arctic, became very vividly focused and a clear and present belief in an obligation to become engaged regardless of what our federal government did in order to be responsive, not just to what was happening in Alaska, which was significant and is significant with melting permafrost, with all of the things that you've heard, changing weather patterns, sea temperature rise, the advance of ocean acidification, the impact on communities by coastal and riverbank erosion where many of our smaller communities are located, the advance of new forms of insect life that could both be building of existing ecosystems, but also could be very devastating. All of which and more is happening where we live. But also a belief that if we in Alaska can do our part to be responsive to what was happening within our borders, that hopefully we could also learn from, certainly, but also be engaged with other subnational governments, even national governments, NGOs, other institutions, both, again, within the United States, but also globally, and help build, as small as our part might be, particularly in emissions. Alaska is a very small, very rural place, other than the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay, very little industry. And so some argue that our emissions are so small as to not be worth any effort to be engaged. And of course, to us, that is the worst kind of attitude, that every action that we can take, no matter how small, is important and ultimately beneficial. We also have a sense, with roughly 20% of our population being Alaska Native or Alaska's First Peoples. I'm a Tlingit, and what I wear is my clan symbol. We believe that the climate change space, both locally, nationally, and internationally, while it is robust there is still so much room for questions to be asked, even questions that we don't know how to pose yet, that it can be a space where indigenous peoples across the globe, but again, particularly where we live and in the Pacific Basin, can become engaged in ways that allow those who are heavily impacted, and they are now, to have a real and meaningful voice as we develop our collective future. The notion of an Indigenous Climate Change Alliance is one that within the framework of Alaska's climate change response, we will pursue and are already pursuing. But of course, we also are engaged as fully as we are able with all institutions that we can identify or can identify with us, such that together we can be as responsive as we possibly can. So the bottom line for us is that we will be engaged. We will do it aggressively. We do not have a lot of resources. We do not have the kind of knowledge that we need to have. We have included the University of Alaska as a key part of our climate change work moving forward, in addition to the climate leadership team, which is composed of leadership individuals representing themselves and institutions across our state, so that hopefully every voice is heard, which is a key tenet of our administration. But we also have an internal cabinet level climate leadership team that will be working in parallel with the public team, and will also be looking at the responsibilities of their own cabinet level work in order to be responsive as we move forward. We are engaging in ways that may be way above our pay grade, but we do so nevertheless. At a meeting this morning at the Chinese embassy, talking with senior officials there about climate change. We'll be meeting with the Canadian embassy. We'll be reaching out as much as we are able in order to create, hopefully as we are here, as I know we are here, a conversation, a discussion that can lead to hopefully learning, strengthening, capacity building in every way that we possibly can. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Mike. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. We appreciate that. I have with me two colleagues here, Dave Bolton and Sherry Goodman. But before I turn to them, I wonder if you would respond to the following. In the document, in the draft policy document, the states group does not shy away from words like climate change and perhaps different uses of the terms carbon taxes and reinvestment of industry based on their development to try to reinvest into communities and infrastructures and transition the way you spoke about. Was there discussion, or is there discussion in the state about using those terms, climate change, in a resource-rich, resource-dependent state like we perhaps see elsewhere in our country?
We use those words not to be provocative in any way, but as a response to the reality of its existence and the fact that it is already globally a well-used and understood phrase, climate change. In some places it has political connotations. Governor Walker is a very practical, straightforward guy, and he just said if it's used in common parlance, let's just go with it. And that's kind of the approach. It's straight ahead. We really don't know right now where we're going at least in terms of detail. We have a sense of it. We have a strong sense of obligation to meeting Alaska's needs. We have discussed our approach as being Alaska-centric, but not Alaska-parochial. And I think I've mentioned or emphasized that in my brief comments. But climate change is what it is. It is evocative, I think, in language around the world, and we should use it.
Thank you. So let me turn to Sherry Goodman, a senior fellow in the Polar Initiative and the Environmental Change and Security Program. And Sherry, I believe we have a microphone coming down the aisle for you. Great. Please.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. It's a privilege and an honor to have you here at the Wilson Center. And let me thank you for bearing witness to climate change in your state and from your own personal experience. I think that is vitally, vitally important. And you do a great public service through that effort. You characterize in the flyer here on the Climate Action for Alaska, Alaska as ground zero for the impacts of climate change in our country. And I certainly, and I think all of us would agree with you on that. It reminds me of the way we characterize climate change in a national security context as a threat multiplier for instability. And indeed, we see that affecting our forces and our national security posture, especially in the Arctic, as we move to reassess our military and national security needs in the state and in the region overall. But I would ask you if you could share with us, given that Alaska is really ground zero for climate change, and now you have done this collaborative partnership effort within the state to assess climate impacts, what are your top priorities to affect climate action in the state, and what help do you need, since you're here in Washington, obviously with a purpose, what help do you need in Washington to begin to put that climate action plan in place?
We know that there has been much science and research undertaken around the world, even in our state, but change is happening so quickly, and even those things which have already been studied and measured are already capable and ready for further science and research. And we need that to continue. For example, the change in permafrost, which is happening. Almost everything that we're discussing by way of change in Alaska is, I think, without particular argument, happening at a faster pace than anyone just a few years ago might have predicted. And so just the notion of keeping up so that we can have the kind of science, that we can have the kind of discrete and necessary knowledge to make public policy decisions is going to be so important. So that's one of the things that we will continue to do here in Washington. We also are reaching out to our neighbors. Alaska borders Canada on the east, and except for a small body of water separating us, borders Russia on the west. And so even though we are a subnational player, the opportunity and the requirement, the obligation of significantly for our state is to engage with those governments, to learn what they are doing, to understand what is happening in their places, the reality of which is very similar to what is happening in our state. So we have been reaching out to the subnational governments in Canada, those that border on the Arctic, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Yukon Territory, British Columbia to some degree. We've had conversations recently with the Russian government about working with their research and their regional and local governance institutions to both learn and hopefully to share. We also need resources, financial resources, in order to be responsive to that which we do get to a point of having to deal with. Village relocation is one that we are already dealing with, and the federal government through the Congress has assisted in a small way to move a village. Literally costs hundreds of millions of dollars before it's all said and done. We need to build partnerships so that what we learn and what we experience can hopefully be understood and shared by others. So again, that shared experience can become real in the policies and in the actions that we take. Right now, to be, for example, very specific, we have in Alaska what is called the Denali Commission, which was created to coordinate among federal agencies and to be a fiscal vehicle for the receipt of federal funds to deal with rural development in our state. We believe that that's an institution that can become a climate change locus for action and for federal and state and NGO cooperation. And when we're here in Washington, we will continue to work with the federal government and particularly our congressional delegation to see that that institution remains. There are 101 actions like that we need to be involved with.
Great. Thank you. Ambassador Bolton.
Thanks, Mike. Lieutenant Governor, I've had the privilege of hearing you speak many times, and I just want to say I really appreciate the sense of history and community and dignity that you bring to these discussions. And I'm also struck each time I learn something new, encounter some new idea. So for example, I expect that for many people in this audience, the notion of creating some kind of partnership of shared interests among indigenous peoples of the Pacific region on an issue like climate change, it strikes me as a really intriguing idea. You also spoke today about your children and your grandchildren. And so I'd like to ask you a question that takes us 20, 30 years into the future, beyond the time when you were on stages like this in the office you currently hold. If we're going to meet the challenges of climate change, it seems to me that at that point, the economies of places like Alaska need to look somewhat different than they do today. Do you have a vision for how the state can diversify and perhaps not be so dependent on hydrocarbon development to fund its budget? How do we get from here to there?
Thank you. Well, by way of necessity, we are already well on that road. When the governor and I took office, oil prices had plummeted from over $100 a barrel to $26, which reduced Alaska's state revenues from petroleum by $4 billion, which was at a time when, depending upon who was counting, state revenues were roughly 80 to 90% funded by proceeds from petroleum development, again, almost exclusively on the North Slope in the Prudhoe Bay fields. We also have, based upon the vision of prior Alaska leadership, a permanent fund, which is now some $65 billion and growing. And just this past weekend, the Alaska legislature and the governor, working together, have created a fiscal mechanism that allows up to 5% of the revenues from the permanent fund on an ongoing basis to be utilized by state government. It would still allow the permanent fund to grow, and that will reduce our dependency on petroleum from when we took office, as I said, between roughly 80 and 90% to some 15%. So that in itself is a very huge step. We need also, and just looking at that 30-year period, within that 30-year period, we should be able to see the end of fossil fuel development. I think it will be more market-driven than it will be public policy, but it will be a combination. And by that time, we must have in place the end state that we seek. In the meantime, we should be investing and invigorating every possible way to increase non-fossil fuel energy capacity. Again, in Alaska, we are on that road. I think roughly 10% of Alaska's energy is now from non-renewables. We have a goal in our statement that would allow that to increase significantly. We also need, again, looking 30 years out, to have a revenue stream from non-renewable energy sources that will allow us to invest in renewable energy resources. We also need to be responsive, and these issues are all going to be very difficult. We had, for example, just within the past 2 years, roughly 70% of the Gulf of Alaska's cod, I think it's Pacific cod, but I'm not sure, cod biomass literally disappear. And that has been attributed to ocean temperature change that has impacted that part of our seafood economy in Alaska in a very negative way. I suspect we will have more blows like that to other sectors, including continuing in the seafood sector. And we must have the flexibility again in our revenues and in our planning and in our relationships with the federal government, with others around the Pacific Rim that will be affected in similar fashion, but certainly likely in very different ways, and have the ability to work together in order to have robust and timely responses. Hopefully in 30 years, we will also be in a place where a young man like Sam Schimmel will be in significant leadership and will be able to be at that time continuing to energize the youth that he will then be responsible for in order to continue the effort. I also think it's important that, and I just hope to God this is true. I believe in my soul it is true, because I believe ultimately in human capacity, both individual and collective, that in 20, 30 years from now, we will be speaking of climate change in positive terms. That we will have by then a recognition in public policy, particularly of our very largest governments, that that investment is necessary, that it is vital, and that we will, as a result, have made sufficient progress that we can begin to delineate future options for our planet that are positive that we aren't able to do now. And right now, I think, as I think of my children and my grandchildren and even my 2 great-grandchildren, I started very young. our language, our effort, our belief, and ultimately dealing with climate change in such a way that our species and that our planet continues, both to support us and to do so in a rich way, depends on our attitude. And I think we should begin even now developing a positive attitude in our conversation about climate change. And to wrap it back again to my grandchildren, I cannot conceive of talking to my grandchildren in negative terms about something that I believe they will have a responsibility to deal with in their future. That is just counterintuitive to everything I believe, and I think everything that we collectively believe. And we shouldn't be creating a false premise. We shouldn't be creating, we shouldn't be singing Kumbaya by the graveyard. And I believe that we won't be. But I think right now we need to be injecting our youth with a sense of promise, a sense of possibility, a sense of enthusiasm for the ultimate result that thus far in this debate we haven't.
Thank you. I want to follow up just on one issue, and then I will open it up for a few questions from the audience. You've referred to your family, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. You referred to communities, future leaders. So I wonder, in this process of the leadership team, what inputs will you seek from the communities, the very communities that are being impacted negatively by climate change and might also benefit in some ways from climate change? I think that's important. We had on this very stage the elders and representatives from the village of Newtok who came to tell their story, and that was way before the appropriations bill was set forward. And that was a palpable story, to listen to those very people who have maybe a year or two left to their village. But that was a community-based narrative that was really palpable here. And we'd like to think we played some small role in advancing at least that issue for that village. But those villages really need voice, not just the resources to move. So I would wonder, along as you and the team go forward and the governor speaks to you about the process, what role will communities have inputting into this policy, but perhaps more importantly, what role do they have in shaping their own future?
We, in this area, I speak with the conviction of my life, having lived and grown up, as I said, in a small community. My mother, a full-blooded Tlingit lady, who never had the opportunity to realize her life's potential because of the circumstance of our lives. Everything I do in my life is geared to the notion that I would hope that when I'm done, it would cause my mother to smile. When she lived, she would smile among her peers, among those ladies in her community, sitting around a kitchen table, eating seagull eggs dipped in seal oil, drinking tea, eating pilot crackers, eating dried fish, speaking their Tlingit language, vibrant and lively in their conversation, laughing with one another. And this a little boy sitting at her feet. And then later watching her out in public in our own community with the non-native part of our community, never smiling and wondering why. Withdrawn. So what I'm speaking to is we must not just change the physical conditions of our planet. We must change ourselves. The result of all of this should be a good and strong society in which every individual has opportunity, in which no one is left behind, in which all of those things that has degraded segments of humanity, particularly built on race and ethnicity in our history, are gone. To some degree, that still affects us today in communities like Newtok and Kivalina and Shishmaref. And we must get to a time and a place. We must be immediately responsive for sure. Newtok is already moving to Matarvik, and we must be fully engaged in that process. And even in that process, we must look at the move as being a positive thing for the community, something that they embrace, they support, because they have had significant involvement and responsibility for it. Again, I grew up in a time when little things can change our lives, at least little in the larger context. The state of Alaska had what was called force accounting, where projects in smaller communities could be funded to the local community, and they had full responsibility for it. I remember I was mayor of my little town when I was age 22. And we applied for and got a grant from the state of Alaska, brand new state, of $25,000, and rebuilt a retaining wall along our main street. And we did it ourselves, and we were proud of it. And it meant something to us as community members. And then someone said, well, local people aren't getting paid enough. We need to pay them union wages. I have nothing against unions. They have made a difference meaningful difference in our society in many ways. Force accounting went away by force of statute, replaced with Davis-Bacon, replaced with contracting, hiring from hiring halls in Anchorage and Fairbanks and other places. And so public infrastructure was built by contractors who would come in and build a multi-million-dollar school and drop it like a spaceship into our communities. And we had no responsibility for it. We had no sense of ownership. We must bring that sense of ownership back in the way that we conduct our affairs. To have a community move and have leadership there say, we did it. We're responsible for it. Recognizing significant resources that we could never do it by ourselves, but it's ours. That will be a successful community change. So my point is, more than anything else, as we evolve our future, as measured by our response to a changing climate, it can't be business as usual. You can't just throw money at things and give it to the highest bidder and say, build this, build that. Number one, resources come much harder. And secondly, you must never leave a single place, a single person, and their needs unmet. Now, that could be done in very different ways. And you must always hear their voice. The governor and I could have been very, very efficient in the state's response to climate change. We could have set up a very small group. We could have come up with very specific plans. We could have brought scientists into the room. We could have brought planners. We could have done all of this. But we said no. What's most important is that the voices of Alaskans must be heard. Their will must be heeded. Not just H-E-A-T-E-D, H-E-E-D-E-D, and a sense of responsibility amongst us all must be hardwired into our future in order for it to be successful. That's a long answer, but it speaks to not just what we need to do, but how we need to do it. And being responsive in Alaska, the climate change right now means more than anything else being responsive in our rural areas, where largely rural people, many of them Alaska Native, live. And having that attitude, having that mentality, having that sense of yes, as a society giving back something that had been ripped from their very souls and saying, we're going to do this right. Other than that, I don't give a damn.
It wasn't a long answer, it was a comprehensive answer, and I appreciate that. So, to my left here, to your right, thank you, Casey. And I will share with you all that right after this program, Lieutenant Governor will host a small reception here outside in one of the adjoining rooms. Please, sir, would you state your name?
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and Lieutenant Governor, thank you for being here. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your humanity and the sense of family, because that's something. I've been in 93 countries now. In all these places, we're trying to do it through a scientific method instead of really listening to the people, and I appreciate what you had to say. And I really want to go to the heart of that as far as the positive aspect of climate change, as far as how you see it, and looking at the indigenous peoples. We've had a number of indigenous peoples from different countries. And what, say, 3 or 4 things do you think that we really need in this coalition that should come from them, where they're digging back in their history, looking back at their traditional wisdom, and how do we bring it forward into a very scientific and modern world where they mesh together and really help people in a real and profound way? And again, thank you for being here.
You know, when I was in college, for the time I was there, I found that I couldn't learn very easily. And so I studied political science in order to be able to baffle people with BS and not have to be necessarily responsible for
We are recording this, by the way.
for anything I said or might do. So I think what I just said is a key to it. We must engage people in a way that energizes their sense of responsibility, as opposed to continue to diminish it because of attitudes, which means a conscious effort on the part of those engaged to help bring about that change. We must also be fully open to their range of knowledge, either theoretical or applied. And if we are really true to science and research, or at the very least meaningful understanding, to be able to probe with them their own past, such that it strengthens all of our capacities going forward. Third, they, and I don't just mean indigenous peoples, I'm referring to folks anywhere that change is happening in their lives and there is institutional involvement to shape a future. They must be involved in the critical decision making, not just the recipients of it. And finally, whatever is done should be done in a way that those who ultimately live with the result, whether it's real or was theoretical or otherwise, that they take ownership of it. That sounds easy, but it's not the way we as a nation have conducted a lot of our business for a long, long time. And yeah, so that's how I'd answer that.
Great.
I'll try to make my answer shorter.
No, they're
Sorry.
good. You make them. Casey,
Got this.
thank you so much, Casey. For okay. Do you have your Fitbit on? Because I think you'll.
No problem.
Okay. Okay, right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor. And I'm certain your mom is smiling right now, to be quite honest. And to follow up what you said, I too studied political science, and for the same reason, I think. I recently finished a couple of projects with the Denali Commission that you've mentioned. And in that, you're here in town, and one of the things that you'll be doing is meeting with the delegation. May I ask just a couple of quick questions that emerged out of the consultancy? So there were a couple of observations that ended up being made. I'd be interested in your point of view. So one being that as you know, as we all know, the Army Corps has identified 132 or 136 communities, both river and ocean, sliding in at one level or another. And that with respect to support from the federal government, Newtok having done a stellar job in moving their communities' issues forward, that what got found is some impediments in terms of lack of coordination within the federal agencies. And without saying names, some federal folks said that they don't want to overreach, and the initial communication needs come from the state, and that no lead agency. So when a community needs to go into the process at whatever point on a continuum they might be, that there's no place to put it where the proper muscle can be flexed, so to speak. And in terms of congressional allocations of money, it doesn't come out of the budget, but only in the supplementals, and it only goes to how much money there is, and when it's gone, which I guess is true of most things. And then also two other quick things. One is cost effectiveness, determinations that are taken at the federal agencies, and a subsistence community has less cost effectiveness in the processes than one that is not subsistence. And then also a community support input, financial input, which sometimes is waived, but often is not, and is beyond what a community can afford. So I wonder, forgive me for all these, but in the whole huge range of things that you're doing in terms of the relationship to the federal government, its coordination and its responsiveness, how do you focus that or shape that? Thank you.
Wow, you did study political science. The role of the Denali Commission, as I mentioned, is important. It can bring about a lot of the kind of coordination and priority building, particularly with regard to our federal government. But it is a partnership between the state and the federal government, and so it helps to focus the state's role also. I think the other things that I've said about attitude and involving and truly listening and engaging with local communities, local leadership, is very much a part of that. There is no way that we are going to move even the 30, roughly, that have been identified as in need of some kind of infrastructure support, including moving, even in these next 30 years. We really don't know where climate change is taking us. When I mentioned at the start my life at just living in a small place on the ocean with rivers all around us and glaciers, and knowing that there's nothing more constant than change, not just in our human lives, but in the physical places in which we live. It just leads me to the conclusion that we really don't know where we're going. We don't have a strong sense. And in these 30 years, I think we need to build in flexibility to our responses. We need to think in new ways about, if you move 30 communities, let's say $250 million apiece, that's a lot of moolah. And the question becomes whether that is the best way to do it. Communities have adapted. Communities for generations and generations have lived along riverbanks, and they have moved. Certainly now we have hardened infrastructure that needs to be dealt with, but I think we can even rethink that. So I think, my response would be, we need to be innovative, we need to think differently, we need somehow to find ways to view our future that's not built on now, but in what is possible for us, looking at the totality and then the discrete of the need, and saying, are there ways we can do this differently?
Thank you. We'll take another question. Casey, you're right there, so maybe just right in front of you here. And while we're preparing your comments, okay, great, thank you. If you just introduce yourself, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Rod Ross, formerly with the National Archives before retirement. who just spent a week in Sitka with a Knox College-sponsored trip. So while in Sitka, so this is really relating to your role as governor's advisor on fisheries. I heard about a citizens' initiative that may or may not be on the ballot relating to salmon and rivers. Could you describe that initiative, talk about the pros and cons, and what's your position?
I think it's called Stand for Salmon. It's a citizen sponsored initiative which would essentially reshape the way Alaska manages habitat across our state. The way that, and I must mention that there is a lawsuit by the sponsors of the initiative in which the Lieutenant Governor of Alaska is is the defendant, so that might give you a sense. But we believe that that initiative is vastly overreaching in its consequence, that we do need to revamp Alaska's habitat and wetlands and other water areas management, but that initiative is a very significant overreach. The reason that I rejected it as an initiative for the ballot was on the advice of our Department of Law, which held that it was unconstitutional in its overreach. But that's not to say that our administration will not continue to work with those involved in order to strengthen our habitat management laws and regulations to be responsive to the need.
Before the next question, I just wanted to follow up on Anita's point about the crosswalk, my words, between the state of Alaska's policy development, how you advance the policies, whether it's infrastructure development, money to move, money to invest in our communities, and what the federal agency or agencies should do or going to do, might do. And so I would imagine, this is a question, I would imagine that the policy that's here will get input from Alaskans, and then there will be a decision made. And at some point, there will be a crosswalk between which federal agency has responsibility for what component of the final policy, from which joint work teams, or at least an overlap of effort to identify not just who's responsible for the policy implementation and what the citizens of Alaska would like, but also where the funding comes from, and then a strategy to execute. Does that sound like the course that you're headed down?
It is, at least to the degree that it involves the federal government. The federal government has a role. After all, we are citizens of the United States. But we also believe that by building partnerships and relationships around the world, literally, that again, we can learn from one another, that hopefully we can find resources that we can share collectively. I think in the climate change space right now, and this is just a little old Tlingit boy from Yakutat voicing his personal opinion, we're a long way from meaningful both national and international public policy in this that is capable of being implemented in a significant way. We're far from that. We have a long way to go. And for the citizens of our world, and for subnationals, and for peoples who are caring or are affected already, to sit and wait for public policy action is the height of folly. I think it's going to take citizen action at every level, ultimately, in order to induce our national and international institutions to be responsive. We had at the Alaska Federation of Natives convention last fall in Anchorage, our largest annual gathering, and there was a panel on climate change. with three very distinguished panelists, leaders in that space, including a journalist. And it was interesting. These were very thoughtful folks, and the ultimate response they had to what's it going to take to get the kind of movement and the kind of focus and the sense of priority and the allocation of resources that we need. And to a person, they said this: revolution. Think about it, and where we've come this far, how far we have to go, with the sense of urgency that is there. And I'm not advocating revolution. What I am saying is that Alaska, in many ways, is driven by this notion that for our own people, for our own space, for this incredible place that we call home, that has been so wondrous in its caring for our peoples for millennia, that we can't wait. And we'll be engaged, and we'll engage with anyone else who believes the same way.
Thank you. Maybe up here, I saw Rafe's hand. Maybe Rafe in the front, and Casey, Jack here to my left, your right, Rafe. Thank you.
Lieutenant Governor, great talk. Thank you for sort of expanding on her horizons on the humanity of all this. I should say I'm Rafe Pomerantz. I chair Arctic 21. I heard you mention that you're going over to the Canadian Embassy, and I wanted to know if a conversation like the following might happen. In less than a month, the G7, or I like to say G6.5, will be gathering in Quebec. Climate change is on the agenda. Normally in the G7, there's a consensus document, but because of the U.S. position, I think last year we just didn't sign the declaration. It was 6, I think. And I suspect the same thing happens this time. But the question for the Canadians, in light of the massive, or what we call the unraveling of the Arctic, and the meeting is in Quebec, which reaches all the way up to Baffin Island. This really has a lot of Arctic characteristics. It would seem there's a chance for Canadian G7, wishfully, leadership to draw attention to the Arctic, to Alaska, to drive global ambition, because there's only so much time left. So as you go over to the embassy, I'm wondering, maybe this will come up. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, certainly not in the context of G7, but in the context of sharing similar climate change issues as we know them now, and from a subnational level being engaged with the Arctic territories and the province of British Columbia, talking about related issues there. We are engaged with the Canadian government at the federal level on ANWR, the 1002 area, which the state supports exploration of to determine what is there. And also the porcupine caribou herd, which is managed by treaty between the two governments. We'll talk about that and what we can do together. We'll talk about the Gwich'in people and their concerns and how we might be responsive or at least understand what those issues are. We'll talk about transboundary rivers, rivers which rise in Canada and flow into the United States. In our instance, Alaska, some 4 or 5 rivers, including the Yukon, which is subject to a separate treaty, but still a transboundary river. And try to create relationships and knowledge that allow us to move forward together. And at the very least, for the few moments that we're there, and maybe even while they're at G7, if climate change is on the agenda, allow them to get their minds off of NAFTA for maybe 5 minutes.
Well, at that point, we're going to move to the next question here on my left. Please, thank you. And then we'll come back to this side of the room.
I'm Robin Michael, and I do work for a federal agency, but I just wanted to follow up on the last question. From Alaska's point of view, which is easier to deal with, the Canadian government or our federal government?
The question is, from Alaska's perspective, which government is easier to work with? The Canadian government or the U.S. government?
I refuse to reply on ground.
I was simply repeating a question.
No, we have issues with the Canadian government. They, of course, are very adamantly opposed to opening of anything in the 1002 area. They have done more research than the United States has on the porcupine caribou herd, and we want to be able to work with them to strengthen that capacity on our side. With regard to our own government, the U.S. government, we are chagrined as a state of the Union, and with the impacts that our state is already living with in climate change, that our government is not engaged, and that it very much should be, and ultimately must be and will be, in order for the world to be responsive. The leadership role there, internationally and nationally, and even among our own states, is huge, and it is regrettable. But having said that, we continue to engage with federal agencies every single day in order to make progress in a meaningful way. But in some ways, the stance of our own federal government has given us a sense that we need more to be engaged at the subnational level with other governments in ways that that otherwise we would not be.
Thank you. There's a question here in the front. Thank you, Casey.
Thank you. Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, Georgetown University. My question has to do with Russia, which you mentioned, and the discussions, and I was wondering about current political climate for discussions with Russia. I know you've been involved with the Arctic Council and had some real success there in the past. What's going on now?
Our conversations with Russia on the subjects that I mentioned took place before the revelations of election tampering, of the issues that very much are creating more tension now between our two national governments. Occurred before a change in ambassadorship to the United States. And so those conversations are pretty much on hold. However, we have engaged with the government of Yamal because they are involved with the export of LNG from the Arctic. They are also a government that is very cognizant of their own obligations to their own people, to their country, and to the world in climate change. And they are very anxious to be engaged with other places at the subnational level on issues like climate change and economic development and the transition from fossil fuels to a different state. So again, we'll engage with in whatever way we can.
So before the next question, and we do have time for several more questions, so just bear with me for a moment. Speaking about Russia, we share the Bering Strait with them. So many of our friends and colleagues here know that we have issues related to search and rescue. We share the Bering Strait for transportation. Our peoples shared one land, one culture, one language. Long ties with Russia, especially across the Bering Strait, Chukotka, elsewhere. Which makes me think about the shifting climates and perhaps this idea of increased traffic in the Bering Strait and what, in this idea of a climate change policy and the needs of the state of Alaska. And we will see more commerce in the north. Have you discussed an idea of a series of ports or infrastructure development along the Bering Strait that would not only support the citizens, whether it's a port in Nome or other places, Coast Guard enhancements, infrastructure for maritime shipping and commerce, as it relates to not just the shifting climate, but workforce development and the future of our state?
We're engaged in each of those areas. In addition, the fact that winter ice is, which used to be, even if I recall, Sam, in the Bering Sea area, could be multi-year ice, or at least significantly thicker and stronger ice than has been the case now. That the access to resources for subsistence is becoming a real issue with residents of the area, particularly on St. Lawrence Island, where Sam's ancestral home is. And dealing with that is a high priority right now for us. How do you allow people access to resources that were never taken for granted, but which were always available and now are not, without significant safety and cost and even to some degree different methods. The need for the underlying policies and regulations and even international accords to manage traffic, to management, all that will be undertaken in the Bering Strait and in the adjacent oceans and seas are hugely important. And again, that is one of the reasons for engaging with Canada. It's a reason for engaging with Russia, and it's obviously important to engaging in the confines of our own government. And I know a lot has already been done, but much more remains to be done. A very important action by the prior administration to bring some kind of governance and management structure for all of the things that you mentioned and more had been put in place. It was taken down by the new administration soon after that administration took office. We are working with at least Senator Murkowski of our congressional delegation to be responsive to local and regional initiative in that whole range of issues and responsibilities that you've just mentioned. And hopefully we'll be able to come up with some large, or at least larger than individual agency response, because it is a collective responsibility, and we're working with Senator Murkowski's office on that. We are working with the regional tribal associations and with the Bering Sea Elders Association in bringing their voice, well, not bringing their voice, they have brought their own voice, but in supporting that voice and working with them, again, on these full range of issues, because, you know, the Bering Straits could well be the Gibraltar of our future relative to the transportation of so much that is critical to our ocean economies, our world economies, and ultimately our societies. And that is a very tight space indeed. What's the furthest distance across, 40 miles, something like that.
50
Yeah.
or so. Thank you. To my left here, thank you, Jack, and then we'll come back across here.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Tufektis, and I work for a federal agency many know and love, NASA, with an incredibly tiny presence in your state, but we do launch scientific balloons from Poker Flats, Alaska, and have some tracking and communications equipment in the state of Alaska. I came here prepared in the sense that my education as a planner teaches me a lot about engagement and about climate change, but I realize now unprepared to understand the politics of a state that's chosen a non-political, a non-partisan state government. And I wonder if you could, I think you've already shown us many of the positive aspects of how that can help a state deal with the issues associated with climate change. I wonder if you can help us understand some of the sacrifices involved in that. Perhaps, as you were just discussing, the connection with other politicians and the ability to create certain coalitions may be a little more difficult. My social studies teaching father might be upset with me for not being ready for this question, but how do you cope with this very different circumstance, and what behind the scenes might we not recognize is another challenge of a very different structure for taking on issues such as climate change?
Yeah. I guess the reality is that the governor and I don't think about it a lot because our focus is on just dealing with Alaska issues. And that's one thing about being nonpartisan allows you to do. Isn't that cool? You know, we aren't worried about big national issues. Certainly, we have to be engaged. We're part of the United States. We're part of the world. We need to understand. But we work hard to you know, Governor Walker often says, and he's a lawyer, which I try not to hold against him. And he often says, let's try to resolve this over a cup of coffee at a kitchen table instead of the way we've come to deal with many issues these days in a very different way. Now that can sound kumbaya, but if you try to live to it, it can make a difference. And that's really the way we try. It's been interesting that in the almost 4 years now that we've been in office, the time that partisan discussions or the use of the words Democrat and Republican have come up in significant public policy discussions, I can count on both hands. Literally. And it's a notion that your obligation is to the people of your state, and you take that more seriously than almost anything else in the service that you have undertaken and the oath you have taken. We work hard to not let value-laden or ideological belief-driven issues or climate in the context of the conduct of our work take serious hold of the decision making that we have to make. Again, that's something you have to do consciously. You have to think about it. You have to work at it. We don't impugn anyone else's reasons for believing as they do or even acting as they do. But you kind of can tell where I come from as an Alaska Native. Governor Walker, who is non-Native, comes from a very different Alaska. But we found in the course of our campaigns, I was running for for governor as a Democrat. He was running for governor as an independent, although he was a registered Republican. That during the course of the campaign, we got to know one another and we got to really liking one another. And that caused us to think, you know, how could we come together this way, and how can that inform both where we've come from and how we've got to this place, and how can that inform us going forward? I guess the bottom line that I would use is that we have to think of it consciously every day, because there are so many forces dragging you in so many different directions if you let it happen. And that takes a lot of energy. But I'm also energized by being able to work in an atmosphere where partisan junk just isn't there. It is so cool, I tell you. So cool.
Thank you. Let's see, to my right and then to my left. Thank you. We do have a couple, these will be a couple of the last
Thank
questions.
you, Lieutenant Governor. I've never been to Alaska, but I have a nephew who is in the Park Service in Anchorage. And I plan on visiting him not this summer, but next.
Good.
I'm wondering, are there not some positive aspects? We've heard all the negative ones about climate change, but clearly the Northwest Passage is going to increase in trade and bring new settlements, new commerce to northern Alaska. And I wonder, too, about, is there any hope for agriculture development in Alaska? It comes to me, remember the pilgrims and the people who came to North America in the 1600s and 1700s. This was hardly an accommodating place, and they left behind a very comfortable and familiar way of life. Now, maybe fish will even disappear, although that's not likely, at least it may diminish. But is there any hope for agriculture? Are there parts of Alaska which are arable? And if so, would it not be possible, as the United States did in the 1700s, 1800s, to take vast quantities of federal land and give it to people to farm and to commence commerce and build new communities? I'd love to hear your comments.
For me, I guess I would say, just as I've mentioned several times here, we don't know. We really don't know what the consequences will be of the changes that are happening, at least in very discrete local areas. We already have agriculture, modest agriculture in our state. It's something that, in terms of fostering food security, which is a priority of our administration, that we are working to create greater opportunity for. The weather is warming. We don't know whether that will create a climate that fosters a climate that people want to live in. It could be very different. We really don't know. We do know for sure that weather is changing. Weather patterns are changing. The notion of freeing up federal land in Alaska, you're welcome to come join us try.
I was waiting to see how you would handle that.
Alaska's lands are roughly 64, 65% under the jurisdiction of our federal government. And most of those are in environmentally sensitive and classified areas. So public use of any different kind would be very difficult, but even there, we don't know. We've had glaciers in Alaska that were for generations prime tourist draws and have disappeared. And now we've had to put in one national park, I don't know whether it's a park or some federal jurisdiction, tour boats on the lake that the glacier created to be able to go around the corner and look at the glacier, whereas the big glass enclosed viewing area. You used to be able to, in my lifetime, see it up close. And we're facing the same thing in Juneau, where they're talking about putting tour boats on the lake to see the famous Mendenhall Glacier. So we don't know. And also we have the reverse. I never forget the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, and it's the Inuit Circumpolar Council now, a union of Inuit peoples across the north, international. The head of the ICC, maybe 15 years ago, when climate change was just beginning to emerge as something to talk about in our state, pounded the podium, and said, "We Inuit have a human right to be cold." And yeah.
So
But I would say, in terms of the language we use, if we look at climate change, and there's good reason that we use a lot of doom and gloom now, and there's sound reason for it, but we don't know what the future will bring. And we really don't know what the impact of national and international focus, when it does happen, and I believe it will, can bring to bear on that subject, such that we can be truly and positively responsive. The thing I want to give to my children is a future of hope. And that's what we all have to do.
So we have one final question. I'll just remind everyone that we have a reception immediately following across the hall. And then after this question, we'll have just some wrap-up comments, and then we'll adjourn to the reception. Please.
Laurie Krieger from the Manoff Group. I've been working on an ADEC project. And in talking with people in villages, we hear from the tribal councils over and over again how disempowered they feel because regulations come from Anchorage and there's nothing they can do about it. And they say, why don't the people just come here? What steps have you taken, practical, specific steps, and what will you take to motivate the government agencies in Alaska to listen to the people?
I hear that all the time. I believe it. But I also believe we have an obligation to go to the government people and grab them by the scruff of the neck and say, listen, buddy, listen. Some of you may recognize that there was a time in life when I was a long-haired activist, and sometimes even more than an activist. I work hard to be positive. But Sam, I believe this profoundly. In the end, it will be us, not government agencies, that will determine our future. And if that doesn't happen, shame on us. But I believe that it will happen, and it's happening now to some degree. Yeah. In terms of specific actions, we've, in our administration, we've ended over a decade of litigation. I don't think we have a single case outstanding between a tribe and the state of Alaska today, when we inherited probably a half dozen. The effort is to allow and create the opportunity for every Alaskan to live their life as they choose, to have a sense that their voice will be heard, and to the degree that they can make it manifest, heeded, and that as a government, we have an obligation to consciously reach out to people and not the other way around, although that is vitally necessary also. And that to the degree that we can make government transparent, to the degree that we can communicate effectively, we have a goal that we aspire to, and that is ultimately the government of Alaska will be respected by its citizens. What a goal. As a little kid, I remember when you kind of took that for granted, but not anymore. The notion that government can be respected for the role that it plays and the decisions that it takes on behalf of its citizens because they are engaged in such a way that a citizen or a supplicant or someone who has need can say when a decision is taken, I may disagree with it. I may not have gotten the answer that I sought. I may not even have gotten the service that I sought. But my voice was heard in such a way that I can respect the decision that was taken, and I know I will have another opportunity. I don't think we can try to create a space for government, meaningful governance beyond that. Thank you.
I'm going to leave it on that message and let that be the wrap-up comment for the afternoon. I want to thank you all for spending the last 90 minutes or so with us. I want to thank everyone online for watching. This has been recorded, so you can refer back to it. Also on the website is the draft policy that the climate leadership team has put together. I would ask you to take another look at that. Lieutenant Governor Malott, I want to thank you for delivering this message, but more importantly, perhaps the way in which you have delivered this message. Thank you very much. Please thank Lieutenant Governor Malott. Thank you.